Okay.
Can't see ourselves.
Yeah. Oh, hello everybody and welcome to the 10th and sadly for this series final Heatherleys online event. To everybody who is joining us today and also to those who will join us virtually later on via YouTube. So as I've just said, this is just a reminder that this is being recorded and will be uploaded to both the Heatherleys school page and also their YouTube page afterwards. So anybody who's been to any of the talks so far this term will probably recognise at least one of the three of us. I'm Anna McNay, an art writer, editor and curator, and I've been leading the In Conversations. And today, to round things off nicely, I have the pleasure of talking to the artists and curators Rosalind Davis and Justin Hibbs, who have been talking to people on alternate weeks about professional development and all kinds of other useful stuff. I'm sure, therefore, that they need no introduction, and since there's two of them, we have got a lot of material to get through, but I will give some very brief overview biographies just for anybody who isn't aware of why they're here and what's in store, but I'm sure a lot more will come out during our In Conversation anyhow. So Rosalind is a graduate of the RCA from 2005 and Chelsea College of Art 2003. As an artist, she has exhibited nationally and internationally and has had a number of solo shows in London. Her work is held in a number of private and public collections, including Soho House. In 2016, Rosalind was appointed curator at Collier Bristow Gallery in London, where she curates 3 exhibitions a year. From 2012 to 15, she co-directed the arts organisation Zeitgeist Art Projects, and before that, Core Gallery. In both of these organisations, she ran a number of curatorial projects and an artist education programme, as well as tutorials and art tours. Rosalind is also co-author of the book What They Didn't Teach You at Art School. She lectures at universities, galleries and organisations across the country and mentors for ArtQuest, AN, Plop and also independently. So Justin studied at Central St Martin's, and he too has exhibited both nationally and internationally and has also curated a series of artist-led exhibitions. He has tutored and lectured at various higher education institutions and was course director for the UAL Foundation Diploma in Art and Design at Kensington and Chelsea College from 2016 to 19. He has also worked on a number of private and public collections, including for Daisy Green Restaurant in London. Phew, okay, that's the most difficult part over. So over the past 2 years, Rosalind and Justin have been collaborating on a sequence of site-specific installations, which have been exhibited in several alternative iterations. So our aim today is firstly to introduce both artists and their practices in their own right, and then also to look at some of their collaborative work and ask questions such as what it means to let the other in. Our aim, optimistically, is to talk for about 50 minutes, and I'll be sharing some beautiful slides for which I can take no credit in putting them together as we go, and then we'll open up to questions. And as usual, I've muted everyone to optimise the sound quality. So what I'd ask you to do is, I'm sure everyone knows how Zoom works by now, but there's a chat box kind of in the middle bottom of your screen, and if you can just type your questions into that box, either as we go along so that there are some ready and waiting for us, or if you're really intently listening, you can just wait and type them in at the end, and I'll read them out from there and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. Okay, ready to go?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to start ladies first in very traditional manner with Rosalind. These have been updated since I last looked properly at them, but it's just, I think, captions and credits. So Rosalind, these are images of some of your steel and perspex works, an installation from your first show at No Format Gallery in 2017. And the one on the left is actually, it was beforehand in the studio, and then the one on the right is at the gallery. So you came actually from a background of painting. How did you make that transition into working in 3D? Because this is quite different, obviously.
Well, my paintings, I had been predominantly painting, but they were very much about architecture and about representing a 3D space, whether it's the exterior of a building. And then increasingly it became about reassembling geometries from different architectural architectural sites, I suppose, and to create a third space. So it was very much sort of becoming very 3D on the surface. and not dissimilar to these. I mean, you can look at my website for a few sort of paintings prior to these. And so they're very much related. So in a way, it was a big leap in some regards. It felt, I think as artists, we always feel that way, but actually it was quite natural to then go into that form, but it was also really difficult to visualize how I might turn a painting into a 3D form. And they're not directly related in that way, but there's just this conversation about the language of architecture and the language of modular space. And I mean, honestly, as well, I'd come to an end of a series of paintings and I was also really stuck, and I just did a lot of drawings until I could come to the point where I could actually visualize something that was 3D in actuality, as in I made a drawing that looks very similar to this installation. And then I was like, I know what I'm going to do now. I'm going to get a fabricator to make some steel modular. So modular means that they're just going to move apart. So in the image on the left, there's one main frame, but everything can be moved multiple times. But it was, you know, as well, it was sort of about a year of trying to find my way around the corner and find a new way of making work. And, you know, I was also having a crisis about my art career and what does it all mean, as I think every artist over a period of time does encounter. So it took a long time to get to that point, but it is very, very much related. And then it kind of was a whole exhilarating, you know, the last 3 years of working in this way, as well as I still do painting and other works, etc. But yeah, it was taking basically the structure of my paintings and literally pulling them out and making them into 3D form.
And I think we're going to come back to this idea of 2D and 3D quite a lot in the This is from the same exhibition, and the work was site specific, and already at this stage you were inviting visitors to kind of move in and out through the work. And I think this was, you were actually also, if I've got this right, you asked them to move the work itself around?
Yeah, I had No Format Gallery had offered me a space to have a show for across 2 weekends, and again, all of these parts, there's perspex there, there's steel frames, and I could move them endlessly. And that was what was the interesting challenge about it, or the interesting thing about what I wanted to do with it. I didn't just want to put in one thing and have it stay static. And so I did say to people, you know, come in, have a chat, move it around. And some people, artists that were local, did. But for me as well, it was about creating, the whole point of having that show was that I knew that I could go in and move things around, and it was a different space to my studio, and I could change things around multiple times a day. And given, again, you've given our bio, but I have a lot of other sort of art careers as well as being an artist, and I needed to go through a lot of ideas, compositions, and I was just really, really excited about that. And I was really happy to, it was like a kind of light bulb going off moment, and I also wanted to share that excitement and be playful, because when you were making a painting, it's you in the painting often, and it's quite static and it's quite rigid in that sense, whereas I could say to people, we'll just turn it up, and then it would also respond to the light and the shadow in particular parts of the day, to visitors coming in. And it was also, I'm interested in how other people would play with it, and what they would construct out of it.
Rosalind had these pieces for quite a while by this stage, and we had done a lot of playing with them in the studio to work out, well, what can you do? How do you play with these? So we had already been playing with them, so it felt quite natural to bring that moment, I think, for Rosalind to an exhibition where it's like, okay, these aren't set things here. You know, there's this opportunity to kind of maybe change this. So we tried a few iterations before you arrived at that, but I think the idea of play is quite important.
And also just that, although this is sort of essentially one of the final representations of the work that I did over that course of a week or so, it's not the final work, so to speak. It's just the final conclusion to a week of experimentation, whereas in that place there were lots of final work, so to speak. Lots of images that I took away from that I've included in shows that I see as a final piece of work, but it's working in a very, very different way to having a fixed final piece, so to speak. It's like, well, there's multiple final pieces and multiple things that I think are successful as a composition that I would use or reflect on and, you know, publicize or publish, so to speak, on my website as a final iteration, I suppose. Because it's never final, because this will all come apart again and then it will become something else. So it's a snapshot in time of what I'm trying to achieve, really. Yeah.
And we're going to come back again to the idea of the modularity and the fact that you do kind of recycle things. Just having talked about your painting a bit, this is interesting that you use fabric in your works. And I know that you've spoken before about how you used to go along to crits of the painting group and take anything that wasn't a painting but try to present it in the most painterly way possible.
Yeah, so Freefold I took to a peer crit group that I was part of called the Undead Painters, and I'd always take something that wasn't a painting. I'd take modular sculptures, I'd take a piece of, there was literally no paint apart from the primed canvas. And actually it was such a sort of open and inviting crit group, and it was so informative to me because it was a very experimental piece of work, Freefold, that's on the left hand side of your screen, and the people that were in that crit group pushed me to bring back fabric into my work. But I've always used fabric in my work. I graduated from mixed media textiles from RCA, and I've always used fabric very much in my work as a backdrop. I use thread, I use stitching, and it was a reference to that. But also, it's about creating a painting without creating a painting. It's sort of an expanded idea of painting. Like, well, you could achieve this by draping a particular kind of material that you know and understand, and bringing painting into 3D objects that also doesn't require you to try and emulate it, where it can feel quite forced, I suppose. It was quite liberating, and it was liberating to share it with, again, peers, and I think that's so important.
Yeah, getting that feedback.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is kind of the theme of, I guess, today in the collaboration. So on which note, let's bring Justin in.
Yeah.
This is a photograph from your solo show at Carol Fletcher in 2015, which was significant in that it was the first time that you really brought together all the different aspects of your work. So the let me get this right, wall-based screens, paintings, sculptures, and then also the creation of complete environments, but also mirror works for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I, like Rosalind, had been considered myself a painter for perhaps kind of 15 years after graduating, was just only made paintings. And then I began to move away from that and start to make wall-based works, kind of like large-scale wall drawings, as I termed them. And then I also began to make these works that they're close to paintings. So the image on the left is a large, what I call a screen, but they're inspired by Eileen Gray screens in the early 20s. And they were on very flat metal material, dye bond with vinyl on. And this is the first time that I've also made freestanding sculptures, and I introduced the mirror material. So this show, I think I showed across 5 spaces. So it felt like a mini museum show. So in a sense, it was this opportunity to bring together a lot of things that I had been doing separately under one kind of roof. And it was also the first time that I had, to be honest, a really substantial budget to bring together different areas of my practice, but also they were really keen for me to make new work. So the sculpture in the middle there was the very first mirror work, sort of standalone mirror work that I'd made, although I'd been using this material before. And that was a kind of an accident in a way that led to a lot of further work.
And I know we're going to talk a lot about collaboration, and we've just mentioned in terms of Rosalind, like with playing and inviting the viewers to play as well. Do you see the mirrors as a way of bringing the viewers into the collaboration? Yeah,
well, that really occurred at this point as a kind of an accident. I had this mirror sculpture, another one quite like it, but I also mirrored half of Carol Fletcher's stairwell from floor 1 down to the basement. And what I noticed was, what was really amazing at the exhibition, initially the sculpture was planned to be in black, and then I realized that there was a mirror version of this material, and I thought it would be really interesting to make this piece because it kind of shatters up the space around it. So for me, the concerns initially were much more spatial and architectural. But what happened during the period that this show was on is that we noticed, especially at the Private View, for instance, but other events, that people were going to great lengths to take sort of really interesting selfies of themselves, and also in the stairwell that I'd made. So I mirrored this huge 4-meter wall going down a stairwell. So as you walk down the stairs, you were kind of reflected, and all the stairs were reflected. And these were architectural interventions, but actually what came out was this idea that, so the audience is now in the work and they're using it in this different way. And at first I was really freaked out, kind of like, oh my God, I've made like the perfect selfie art. How do I feel about that? Then after a bit, I kind of realized that's actually really interesting. That's kind of getting somewhere towards where we are sort of culturally and in society with, you know, our phones and that culture, and that people were using the work as a way of kind of recording themselves and moving around it in interesting ways. So that's something that we'll pick back up on, but that it was a kind of byproduct of the work I made, and that's become a focus.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're actually going backwards a couple of years now. This was a show you had, Parasite, in 2013 at the Christina de Mayo Gallery in Zurich, and it was a collaboration again, but it was with someone called Monica Asina Jaeger. Is that right? What was particularly significant about this in terms of your practice?
Well, the image on the right is from that first show with Monica, and this is it's maybe the second screen that I made on the right. The image on the left was from a kind of a second show we did a year later in a museum called Kunsthaus Grenchen in Switzerland, and we made this really, really large kind of, it's what we call Parasite Sculpture. The exhibition that we first did together was called Parasite, and the sculpture that we created together for that exhibition became something that we did over 3 or 4 projects. So on the left here, you've got the biggest iteration of that project. And I think it was good to show this because it's a kind of, in a way, the first, I mean, it's a huge installation, but it was this idea of a kind of site-specific drawing that you could walk through and the viewer would kind of compose it for themselves and you could move in and out of it. And that's become something that we've kind of picked back up in a funny way. So there was this kind of, I mean, I've worked a lot collaboratively in the past, but this collaboration was really interesting in terms of kind of that idea of taking the 2D and manifesting it in 3 dimensions as a kind of physicalized drawing.
Yeah. Which is exactly what I was going to ask about next with regards to this, which was from your show, a group show actually, but called Pencil Line Eraser at Carol Fletcher in 2014. And so this is one of your 2D wall drawings, but you've also got these vinyl adhesive strips, and the black is actually aluminium sheets, if I'm right. So
yeah, so the kind of wall there is painted with emulsion, and then all the lines you can see are vinyl adhesive strips. Mm-hmm. The 3 black objects are actually standalone works that are kind of integrated into the wall drawing. And in a way, I'd made several really large-scale wall drawings at this point. And this was I'd often use them as an opportunity to make a sort of large wall drawing and curate the work of other artists in, because I like that idea of collaboration and the fact that I could create a kind of context which you could then install people's works within. So this is the first one that I did that I installed my own works within it, but it was important. It was straight off the back of that really huge Parasite project. And in a way, for me, that was really important, this idea of what happens when you're in a physicalized space, like a drawing in space, and then trying to find a kind of illusory flat parallel for that, like the sort of projected space of a drawing. And so there's a moment in this drawing, I planned it so as you walked in the door, you had this moment of anamorphosis. So there's kind of certain painterly and drawing traditions going on here, you know, the idea of illusions and sort of grabbing that kind of, so this is basically made out of lots of composite images of that sort of Parasite sculpture and going back to 2D, which is something that we've also really played with.
And we're going to see that as we go through. So let's get on to some of your collaborative works. So this was actually a very early stage in your starting to collaborate together. And it was actually that I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you told me it in the first place. Rosalind, you were stuck. And so Justin, you sent her this picture of a chair, which is on the left, and Rosalind printed it out and then painted over it. And do you want to say a bit more about what you did to it and how that led on to further things?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to work in series, and I've been working on a series at that point in time about the riots. And it's sort of, series often finish for me. I always have this idea that they'll be like really fruitful for like years, and I won't have to worry about source material and where I go. But then it always tends to be like, oh, I've sort of feel like I've come to the end of the conversation about certain points of it. But prior to this riot series, I'd only really been painting the exteriors of buildings, and the riots literally psychologically and aesthetically allowed me to step through, because I was very interested in the social and political and elements of the riots, why they happened, and which relates to my interest in sort of the understanding of social housing and buildings and why they were created. And it was really interesting to go down that road with the riots and like, how did this, happen, and examining it very intensely. But yeah, and then I realized I stepped through this window, but I was stuck as to what happens after you get through the window. And Justin sent me all these amazing paintings, well, photos of these chairs, sort of modernist chairs, which again relates to the buildings I was looking at. And I just printed them out and I just played, because I suddenly saw the chair was part of the architecture of the space, and it was very architectural. It was, this is a Rietveld chair on the left-hand side, which is created by an artist. It also was semi-functional, and I just allowed myself to play. And I set myself rules, and I was painted over this chair, and it helps me understand space and sort of the relationship to space, I suppose, of the composition. So I loved the form, and then I got very involved in sort of how chairs represent relationships. That's things we rest on. They can be conversational, they can be quite sexy, as the one on the right hand side is quite sexy. Mm-hmm. And so it led me off into a place. And I think that the part of the collaboration is sort of opening yourself up to other people's ideas or input, and that was really productive for me, and I couldn't have got there on my own. I think we all need input from other people, whether that's tutors, friends, partners, whatever. Yeah. And then the imagery on the right was then just playing with, Justin had done this drawing in the studio, and I just used my threads. So the piece on the left is threaded. And I just was like, this made it complete. And I think the whole thing about the collaboration is like the strength of bringing in a different vision that adds to something. The drawing that Justin done was gorgeous, but somehow this is even more. And I think that's where we were so allowed a certain amount of trust in terms of intervening a little bit, not necessarily collaborating in the way that we do later on in our slideshow or in our careers, but that you were like, well, yeah, play with this. It wasn't, this sort of very formal thing.
I mean, I was making a lot of drawings like that at the time. For my wall drawings, I was making these linear drawings, and sometimes I would have chairs in. And so I had a lot of drawings like this on acetate, so I could lay them on other things. Yeah. It was just really liberating that, you could have these things in the studio and they could become more of a conversation point. So Ros would just kind of pick something up and stitch it, and then it was on the wall. And that might be an idea for something else, but it was kind of, the start of a kind of interesting conversation in that sense.
Mm. And that's what happened here too, right? This was something that you were stuck with, Justin, that you gave to Rosalind, and again, she sort of stitched onto it.
Yeah, I got a long way through this, and this was the first time I did a very large work. I say very large, it's, maybe
pretty big.
7 foot across or something, but it was made it's vinyl on paper, and the reason it was like that was because it was going to be posted off to an art fair, and I just got a bit sort of bogged down and stuck. Towards the end, like, anyone that makes a painting, you're a bit like, it just needs something, I don't know. And, as deadline's looming, so I'm sort of like talking to Ros, like, I don't know, it just needs something else. So she took some photographs of it, and
Yeah, and then printed them out tiny, and then I
Printed
gave
them
like
out like photograph
multiple
size.
suggestions of what he could do with like playing with the line.
But basically, she stitched onto the photograph with red thread. And in a way, the image it felt really dead to me. So it was like, it ended up with these 3 red lines on, which really helped. But it was this idea of, you know, often as artists, we get stuck in the studio and it's a very kind of, can be a really solo pursuit. And it's just that kind of realization, you know, it's like the phone a friend moment. Oh, it's okay. You can just, you know, I don't know where this is going, but I've got to finish it in like a day. And so she sent me some stuff overnight. I was like, great, that's something I can do. I can work with that. That's really, so yeah, this was starting to happen as a kind of back and forth.
And this was also, so this was originally a painting of Rosalind's that you then painted over. And I guess the question is like, that I guess that a lot of people will be asking is, whose work is it ultimately? It's not actually a collaboration to start with. Does it become a collaboration, or like when you showed that work at the art fair, was it your work? Was it a joint work?
So the previous work that we looked at was very much my work, but Rosalind had been a part of the solution in a way to realizing it. This work was different. This was a work that was in the corner of Rosalind's studio, and it was kind of almost in your bin. It was like in the reject pile. And she was at this stage trying to maybe break away from what she'd done and try to find this other space. So somewhere between a representation and abstraction, which is a really difficult thing to do. And she had this painting that was only partly done. And so we were just talking about it, and it's a bit like, well, why don't we just, like, can I just mask off some areas and do something? And I, not being her, I could really see it quite quickly. Oh, we could just do this and that. And we'll mask some areas and put some like black washes on and see what happens. So it was a work of hers that you didn't feel too precious about. It was then like a catalyst in a way.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that painting had been sat in the studio, and it was a bit like, there is a point when you're not happy with the work, and then you can also then have the liberty of being very free to totally change it, and without being too sort of precious about it. Because obviously when you make a painting, you spend time, it's cost money, you know, materials cost money, but it wasn't doing anything, it wasn't exciting me. But I see it as my work, just as Justin sees the previous work as his work. I mean, it's like, I guess to use an analogy, you know, when you're having a conversation with people, and it might be a teacher, they might suggest something, but then you don't say, well, do you own this work as well?
Yeah.
And it's a funny thing, I think, you know, and it comes through the thing, is that's definitely my painting, just into being literally in an aesthetic way. But it was coming from my origins, my photo, my decisions, and he just helped it along, you know, and that's what a good, you know, teacher does, and we teach each other, if you see what I mean. It's not in a sort of patriarchal way. Justin's not just like, oh, I'm going to interview your work, but it's more like, well, how about this? And I think, you know, if you look at things like chefs, you know, there'll be like a chef that comes along and says, well, why don't you try that? Or, you know, and be quite collaborative and improving a recipe, so to speak. So it's more like that, really. I think but it's very distinctive to us, what's ours and what's our own.
Well, that's sorry.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I mean, this is obviously an earlier one where it was very much your work, but in your later work, which we will get onto, where you're actually deliberately collaborating together, do you have kind of specific roles, as it were? Like, I know, for example, with Biggs and Collings, they're quite clear about who does what, so she does the design and he does the colouring in. Is it like that, or is it more that you literally are bouncing ideas off each other? And
yeah, it's very, very openly collaborative. We don't define roles for each other. We look and we see and have a kind of, as you say, bounce ideas off. Basically position stuff.
It depends what we're working on as well. We used to refer to it as the conversation. So when we were talking about things that happened together, it was just called the conversation. So it didn't have a kind of formal thing, a role in that way, but it might be as small as, you know, the kind of conversations you might have with somebody on a project that you're doing. So was curating a show, or a project that I'm doing, those conversations. And at other times it's literally like, okay, I've got the black paint on the paintbrush and I'm going to paint over your painting now. So it was always kind of quite ad hoc. That although I suppose in the later collaborations there were very specifically things that are Rosalind's, like still structures, and there are very specific things that are mine, like mirror parts, and then it's a conversation between those things. But they're not like fixed roles like colouring in and... No,
personally I would hate to have a fixed role. I think the point of this is about having spontaneity in the studio to fully engage for ourselves with what we're trying to achieve.
And I think that comes across in like the way you talk about it as well.
Yeah.
The idea of the spontaneity and the playfulness. So just to sidestep away slightly from the art, like as a personal question, how did you meet in the first place, and what came first, like the being partners in life or the being partners in work?
Well, we met at an exhibition at the Lion Lamb Gallery that I was part of, that was curated by an artist curator called Jake Clark, and I initiated an artist talk at the end of the exhibition because I was sort of in this painting show that was full of these kind of quite established, male painters, and I was the only female in the show, incidentally. But and it was a really interesting space. It became Terp's gallery in a way, in the terms of the people behind it, the people that were involved in it. It was a brilliant space. It's like a 1950s pub and a white cube gallery. It doesn't exist anymore, surprise, surprise. But it was an amazing show. But I really wanted to make connections, so I suggested that we do an artist talk. And Jake invited people, including Justin. And at that point, I was showing a piece, actually, quite an older piece from what I was actually making at the time, of a painting that included social housing. And yeah, and to go this talk that went on for like a whole day and night. It was amazing, with loads of artist curators. And got talking to Justin, and him sort of asking him what he does. And then he was like, well, I've also painted the same estate as you. And then sort of having a bit of a wow moment.
We connected over the Kidbrooke estate.
Yeah.
Deep. No, but it was kind of like, I was like, we talked about that because I was like, you're painting social housing and I had been painting that kind of architecture too, and then we realized that there were a lot of overlaps in our practice, but it started off literally like, that's my estate, get off. No, I'm from South London, you get off.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like joke at first, but then I think after that we looked at each other's work and it was a bit like, oh wow, there's a lot of overlaps.
But also when you were in the talk, because you came to the talk and you were like, that's a lot of what I would talk about, the sort of political social history of modernist buildings, and feeling like a resonance there. So eventually we became partners in life, and then we started collaborating in a very organic way.
But I think that would just be, at first we started talking about these things in our work, the interests that overlapped. Then, I think eventually we kind of started to visit each other's studio and see, oh, that's interesting. Have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? So just, it was a conversation that developed. But firstly through, just seeing each other's work and the overlaps, really.
Also, Justin was super humble about his work. And then when I went home and did a bit more research, I was like, oh, wow, he's kind of impressive, done loads of stuff. Yeah. But yeah. But it's just the kind of starting of trusting in any relationship, romantic or otherwise, of just how can we help one another or input without it treading on people's toes, I suppose. And that was and it was really exhilarating, sort of going back to the Carol Fletcher show that Justin had, of being allowed to sort of get in his head a little bit and think about how would Justin do it, and open up part of my own brain that would allow me to do that, I suppose.
I think we've got a great picture of you being in Justin's head a bit later on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So actually both of these images are really interesting in their own right, I think. So the one on the left is a photograph that you sourced, Justin, and then painted over, and it's from a series of 1950s school buildings.
Yeah.
and you intervened by basically superimposing the geometric shapes. It's kind of hard to tell from a screen, but that's. Yeah. I mean, what were you looking for in your source material? What inspired you, and was there any idea ever, like any desire to turn these from 2D into 3D, or was it purely?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there was a period where I worked predominantly on photographs sourced from very particular periods, historical periods relating to the sort of different histories of modernism. And this was for a show called, that was eventually titled Secondary Modern, and it was about, all the source material came from an early 1950s book that was this detailing, architectural details really, of like early 1950s, this kind of rebuilding project that went on in Britain, but it was really very much a civic project. So there are things like schools and municipal buildings. But I'm kind of aware at that stage, or thinking very much about the fact that this is very much a kind of, when we say secondary modern, like the B class of modernism, or C even, you know. And I suppose what was going on here is I was thinking about early on in modernism, there's a real relationship between painting, the language developed in abstract painting, and architecture. So architecture adopts the language of abstract painting and reduced form. So I have these images from later on in the 20th century, and I'm sort of reintroducing painting in a way, so these painterly forms. And I was starting to think about, I mean, trying to sort of almost create these slightly impossible spaces. And this is around the time that I do start to think about, can you do this in the space and create these kind of spaces literally? Like I move from sort of painting on a photograph to paint, so working on the wall in the gallery or on the window to get these things to happen. So that was, yeah, that was from that body of work. But we at this point, you know, are also talking. So Rosa's painting on the right relates to that.
Yeah, so it's basically you've taken the composition, or been inspired by the shapes in Justin's work on the left. Was it, again, just a case of kind of playing in the studio, or was it intended to be a work in its own right?
No, it's always been a work in its own right. All of my work is a work in its own right. But it's just about your intentions being concluded and what you feel happy to leave the studio and be in an exhibition. It's not a direct replica, it's like my riff of it. And by the way, also by saying all this thing about being playful, we're very serious about our careers and our art practices. But there's a sort of an element of also allowing yourself time to play in the studio and be adventurous and not getting fixed to one thing. And I think that was one of the things that I became less literal about my practice when I met Justin, about all the different ways that he was approaching his. So again, it wasn't like I'm going to copy that. It was just that's a really interesting way to approach your practice. And that's why if you go to art school or you study art A-level, whatever, they get you to go to galleries and you go and look and you basically like copy a drawing of something, and then it helps you learn about somebody's interpretation of something. And that's always a part of an artist's career. I think that you are looking around, not borrowing and copying, but that you're sort of getting into somebody else's headspace, that you're sort of seeing how they see the world. No one is an artist that doesn't do that. And if they are living in sort of hermetic seclusion and don't look at art, then I would be worried.
And I think what's quite important as well at this point is that from Rosalind's work, when I met her, they were essentially figurative paintings, and she's making a transition towards a kind of abstraction. And I've been playing with the idea of what happens if you collide the language of abstraction with kind of figuration, but doing that in photographs. So in terms of, we do come at all of this from the position of painters. And so Ros is in this difficult transition here, trying to work out, well, how does a kind of abstract painting work? And, you know, in a way, what she's doing is riffing off some of the like more formal and abstract elements to find a way to develop her own language, you know, using the thread that she uses. So these are discussions that we're having at this point as well about, you know, how do paintings work? And in painting, you can have two languages operating at once. You could have abstraction, you could have figuration, you could have all sorts of other things. But so this is a really transitional moment for you.
Yeah, but also the fact I riffed on basically the composition, but it's still abstracted from that. But also then later on, when Justin has his show at Carol Fletcher, this middle ground in the middle of my painting, which is basically a kind of a way that I underpaint all of my paintings, becomes part of Justin's a wash of like a lamp black that you then utilize in your work. So as I showed him how to do that, and because I used to always back up my paintings with this kind of underground, underglaze, I suppose, underpainting, but it kind of created this depth of space, and then I would paint things out, and I still do that. And then Justin has then taken that into his paintings, and I showed him how to do it. So it is very cyclical. We're learning from each other. It's not just like, I'm just like, oh, Justin, you're just amazing, I'm just gonna we learn from each other all the time. And I think that's the problem of thinking that it might just be one-sided in certain people's minds or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned to me before that like it's quite often assumed that as you're the female and as you're younger that you were basically piggybacking on Justin, but that's clearly not the case at all.
No.
But also, I think what's important about that is that the language that we're dealing with has a kind of heritage in modernism or brutalism and all these legacies. And actually, one of the great Achilles heels of modernism was it was a very male-dominated, patriarchal. So I was really interested in people like Eileen Gray, Annie Albers, all these amazing females that were kind of sidelined. So this debate is quite interesting as well about it's assumed that if you work with, you know, geometric abstraction, it's quite a male language. But actually, there's another assumption that I've kind of wanted to deal with, which is that abstraction, or especially geometric abstraction, is often seen sort of on a pedestal or as this kind of almost like spiritual realm. But actually, that it's like that can also be something very personal or biographical. So a lot of the works that I'm making at this point are quite biographical in my head. They're just because it's got straight lines, it doesn't mean that it's not filled with like some emotive qualities or expressive qualities. So these are kind of assumptions that you end up having to like fight against within your practice. And, you know, I'm very aware of, you know, Ros using stitch with this language as a way of puncturing that kind of male kind of masculine language in a way. And that's, you know, these are things that we're talking about. Which is
like my painting on the right. I mean, you can't so much tell, but all the white and black lines and amongst the black is all threads, and I'm puncturing this space that's a masculine patriarchal space that also is important to me in my work. And, you know, as you probably would expect, I don't really take much, stock of people trying to be dismissive of me as an artist. I earned my right to be an artist, and I have a history, so, you know, look it up before you become dismissive.
Yeah, and that was a very condensed biography that I gave at the start as well. I'm very aware of the time, so
I have no idea of the time. So, we haven't got our clocks, but yeah.
Unless there's anything you particularly want to say about this one, but this was you basically sort of trying to get inside Justin's head. And then this is also interesting because this was in the Carol Fletcher show. We've seen this screen in one of the previous pictures, but Rosalind actually did the design, which is the top left drawing. And then she built it together with Evie Jakova and Sasha Bowles. So it is your work, Justin, but actually you kind of saw it for the first time once it was there, ready-made.
This was a really lovely collaboration for me, and it's actually my favourite piece of work from that whole body of work, because it was 6 months of working really intensely to get this show done. It was a really mega kind of operation, and I ended up having for the first time to work with 2 assistants, but Ros sort of actually also took over the managing of the studio, because I was also working with a lot of outside producers, so like fabricators to make the sculptures, but also I had a jacquard weave. There were lots of different projects. I worked with a typographer for the essay, the writer,
sound artist.
There was a collaboration with a sound artist. So I was working with a lot of people at this stage. This conversation has now become this big
epic.
Yeah, this kind of conversation happening with a lot of different creative practices coming into my work. But in the studio, I had Sasha and Evie making these screen works, and right at the last minute, I wanted to create a new work. I didn't have time to really even design it. So by this stage, what was really lovely about it is I think that working in the studio together that intensely for 6 months is people get a real sense of your language and who you are and what you'd want to say. So I was like, can you just design the screen? Here's this kind of almost like the flat plan of my sculpture. That's what I'd like to use as the basis for this last. You go away and draw it and design it, and Sasha and Evie will make it. So this was a rare example of when a work turns up at the end of this process. For me, I get to see it almost completely afresh, and it feels totally me. But it was this amazing moment of getting your sort of eyeballs on, it's like what I'd say, I wish I could just see it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was an amazing process because they really did totally inhabit my world in a way at that point. So Ros did endless drawings like this, where I would almost act like a design director and just say, a bit more black, a bit less here, a bit more over there. And she designed it, they made it. So it was an interesting collaboration because it's definitely, it feels like one of the works that's most me.
But it's also his, I designed it, but it's a bit like working with the fabricator. And I just found it really liberating to do. And also at this point in time, as I referred to in the sort of first part of the talk, I was a bit stuck with my own painting. I was a bit really happy to have a job, an unpaid job, by the way. But I was really happy to sort of have challenges in a way. And I think it was really useful because it just helped me investigate space and how people work with space. And it's the first time I made a maquette. And it was just exhilarating without being like, oh, that's my screen. And oh, if it sold, I'm sure Justin would have generously given me some of his card. But it wasn't really it wasn't the priority. It was like, I'm helping, like in the previous slide, I'm helping my partner. I know how I can help. I have the skills to help. Why wouldn't I? Like, I'd be like, well, I've got my own work to do over here. And I was, this was this huge exhibition that was, 6 months sort of to be able to make. And I was like, let's just hunker down. And I had loads of paintings that if people wanted it, and I had my own career going on, but running my own business. But your priorities are like, well, who needs, just as you would with friends, who needs me right now?
Yeah. So this was Shapeshifters at Art House 1, and this was interesting because it was the first time that you actually placed, so you were still making individual works, but it was the first time you placed them sort of next to each other in conversation with each other, which is the image on the right.
Yeah, so that was the thing, is that actually, because we had separate studios, we'd live, like we'd go and habitate our separate studios. Like I'd go and work in Justin's, I'd be helping with the show. But because I had a lot of massive steel work and perspex, and his were massive sculptures, they weren't actually in our physical studios a lot of the time. So the first time we'd had an exhibition where they were literally in the same space together, in the same room. And then we're like, oh. And then, it sounds sort of stupid saying it now. In the 2016 show, we're like, oh, there's so many relationships, and everyone else was saying it. And we know that already. But then it just kind of, I think, just opened a valve in our brain, really. So that was really exciting. It's just a bit of an aha moment in amongst many aha moments, I suppose.
So Ros, kind of, my mirror sculpture there is sat between an installation, like just to the left of it, and her painting. And so my painting is reflecting her sculpture.
That's across the other side of the room.
But it's now relating to this painting. So again, it's like all these conversations about 2D, 3D painting. The sculpture is acting like a bridge between two separate works. And I like that. For me, I really like this idea of sometimes the artwork's operating to kind of either house another artwork or become a bridge to another artwork. So
the whole point about Justin's mirrored sculpture is it just brings in other parts of the space, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And then the next slides are the next collaboration where we're properly. Oh, that's in our studio actually. Sorry.
Studio, and then this was your next proper collaboration at No Format Gallery.
Yeah, so I was asked back to No Format Gallery, and
actually your solo show. You were invited back to give a solo show, right? But you invited Justin along for the ride.
Yeah, why not? I mean, if you know a brilliant artist that whose work seems to work very well with yours, why not? I don't need the, like, you know, oh, Rosalind Davis. I've had a few of those, and actually it's much more, in a way, I mean, you know, they have their values in their own ways, but because we'd had that Art House One show, and it looked like, oh, we didn't have the space at that time. We weren't living where we live now. We have quite a large space. We both had small spaces, me and you cross, Justin and Broccoli. And we hadn't been able to bring it together in that way. So we're like, let's bring all the stuff together and just see what we do. And No Format were really, you know, accepting of that possibility. And then it was like, oh my God. And this is like a sort of, again, aha moment of like, well, you know, we've done all these small, in the context of this, like small things, like, oh, I've intervened in your artwork, I've like played with this or that. And then we were saying like, wow, this is amazing. And it opened up so many things that we couldn't do on our own. You know, things can look, part of each of our practices will look, you know, without sounding funny, but like, there's lots of things we can realize very successfully. But then it was like, well, wow, this totally changes everything. And again, just being super excited about what we could do, how we could translate it, how we could reformat it, and so on. So it was the, you know, and again, there's a billion photos of that, of the different, you know, we just had to choose one for the show tonight. But there's millions of things that make us question and ponder space and so on. But it was more fixed. It wasn't as modular as my show that I had in No Format. It did stay this way, but the whole point was like No Format Gallery opens out into the street and everything changes all the time. The light changes all the time. So we have hundreds of photographs in which we can kind of think about composition that we might then go back into 2D or whatever.
I think the interesting thing is that most of the conversation before this show on what initiated border controls had come out of people questioning us about, okay, so you're now like partners and you know, you share a studio. How do you divide that space? How do you possibly share a life, share the studio? All this, like, you know, where are the divisions? So in fact, this show was realized really quickly because we had a rare holiday and we came back and we just took all the stuff there and we improvised it within a day or two very quickly. But I think actually what was more important maybe was the kind of discussion that led to this about the idea of border controls and the time that we're in. So actually most of this exhibition was more about the conversation. And its realization is really quick and it was improvised, and a bit like we'd play with things in the studio. It's like, well, we'll just find an arrangement that works. Let's not worry about that. What's important is what are we saying and what's the context. So it was very much about the conversation at this point.
Yeah, and this is another iteration of that same show, but you've kind of reformatted, as you said earlier, that the works are modular, so you can move the bits around. And this was in Kaleidoscope Gallery in the Seven Oaks. But also you've got, I mean, we probably shouldn't start reading text out now as well, but
don't worry about that.
It's just worth mentioning that your titles are actually always quite interesting and clever, because you've talked about the personal level of border controls and letting the other in and the collaborative element, but there's also a political level, because this was happening to the backdrop of Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really important with this project in its inception is that we're being asked these questions about our practice and our collaboration. At the same time, this debate is raging at this point about Brexit. And we're thinking about this idea of like boundaries and borders and, like you said, you know, how to let the other in and to what extent and what does that mean. And so what we wanted to do is very much take this sort of personal starting point and open it out to a wider debate about the political context. And I think what was interesting is that we were aware that the work itself was playing out a kind of visual dynamic, whereas if you put the mirrors in the middle of this kind of metal structures, it becomes very hard to see what's real and what's not, and what's a real line and a boundary and what's an illusion. And we really wanted with these exhibitions to have a conversation about those things that go from the personal to the political, but also to kind of, in a way, the shows, as Ross said before, they weren't predefined. We didn't have all the answers to this. So we did artist talks. We probably did 2 per show, I think, where we really talked to the audience. Like we had a small audience here and we had a talk and we talked about, we think this is interesting, right? You know, from our point of view, all the talk was about, you know, taking back control, but we were a bit like, but we have an idea that maybe being confident enough to let the other in and have an open conversation and collaborate is more powerful. And so the work is kind of playing out formally and aesthetically the kind of things that we want to talk about. So that was, we started to see a different way of doing things, which is where you bring the kind of conversation that's having in the studio into the exhibition, and you try to then, instead of like setting meaning before, it's a bit like, let's have this conversation now. So we were trying to really set the context of that conversation.
But I think also importantly that a bit like we said earlier, there is a lot of personal in the paintings that we make, or the work that we make, that is about our feelings about not just life or love or relationships or the world or climate change. It was about politics, and we're both very very sort of politically proactive in terms of looking and listening to the news and being very, you know, essentially gutted about Brexit. And wondering why so many people didn't want to let people in, or that didn't want to let the other in, which could be people from different backgrounds, nationalities, like economic migrants, refugees, and people so hating that and creating a form that was about opening up. And the piece that we're showing is, it's on an island and it's become an isolated island. So this is different iteration. At Kaleidoscope Gallery, when it came that we're going to become our own island, and in amongst that, I know looking at it, you might not seem, but that's why it's important to read about artwork, is that we were, you know, there are these places that's a port on our way through, but it's on an island, and we're essentially closing off an island. And we don't know what's happening. And even the idea of using mirrors that distort things actually relates in our own way conceptually into the idea of fake news and distortion of information, distortion of facts, distortion of borders. And so the works for us feel very political in a way as well, because that's what's invested in our very kind of selves and cultural kind of capital, if that's what is the right word. I don't know.
I mean, we're trying to make a work as well, I think, where the audience hopefully become aware of their own presence in this work and this idea of borders. So, you know, you're trying to sort of create conditions for a certain conversation as well as make a sculpture.
Yeah.
I'm
gonna, if you don't mind, skip through a few, which is a shame, but I'm just aware of the time, and I wanted to, because you just mentioned about mirrors, Ros, and I wanted to pick up on this one because I think, if I'm correct again, these mirrors actually came out of an accident.
Well, the one on the left did, yeah.
Quite a good anecdote. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, the one on the left comes from initially when I had the show at Carol Fletcher, and I mirrored their stairwell, and it was mirrored in 4 parts that were like 2 meters by 1 meter 20. So it's a really big mirror piece.
Let's do the quick version.
yeah, I'm going to try and do the quick version. And what we basically did, we took Dibond, which is a composite material, and we cut loads of lines in it on a CNC machine so that it would have these stripes. So as you walk down, you'd be almost measured in these stripes. And 2 days before the opening of the exhibition, these things turned up. And in doing this process, I basically, what I didn't realize, like scientifically or physically, is that I ruined the integrity of these Dibond sheets. So basically they came as really rigid bananas, like semicircles, which you couldn't screw to a wall, and it was a disaster. And
it was literally 2 days before the opening of the show.
Yeah, and these things had to go on a very, very flat concrete wall. So I freaked out immediately, but we very great gallery manager was like, don't worry, there's a solution. We'll order more. We'll do stickers for the stripes, blah. Literally within 45 minutes, I was looking at these things and I was like, you know, these ones, the banana ones, can you take those to the studio? So they shipped those to the studio. And then I did a lot of projects with these semicircular cut mirrors. And in a funny way, it was a really good representation of something that's become quite key, which is this idea of like really being sensitive to like things that happen in the studio, but also mistakes or mishaps
or
failures actually. And sometimes those things have become the most interesting things. And this is a case where, you know, the piece now on the left is made intentionally to do that. And quite often, I think one of the things that happens in working in collaborations is there's this sort of maybe slightly elevated sense of awareness about things. So there's a real sense with us about, definitely in my practice, I'm looking for it all the time, but mishaps. So I work a lot with glitches.
Yeah.
And that's a good example of it in a way where, you know, things go wrong, or, you know, there's another example coming up later in the Coppell project where one of these large sculptures snaps in half, and, you know, I'm really furious for 5 minutes. Then 5 minutes later, I'm like, oh, that's great. We've got 2 bits to work with now. How do we solve that problem?
If we can find that one, stop me when we get to it.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. It's the piece on the right that you can't really see.
If you maybe skip to the next photo, it might show it. Yeah,
that black piece is half a sculpture.
So earlier in the slideshow at Sevenoaks, this black piece was actually like a huge sort of 3-dimensional, I mean, it's still 3-dimensional, but it was like mirrored and it was a thing. And this was like the 4th version, 3rd version? 5th of this sculpture that Justin made, that alongside
of those sculptures, I made 3.
That basically they're sort of informed by origami. And the piece on the right hand side, again, it's a bit lasery, but that's been shown in previous slides, is a fold out. It's made from one sheet of sort of Dibond, and it folds out. And the larger piece that is now broken in half, that we managed to reiterate for Coppell in a great way. You know, they literally, we pulled them apart and then they broke a lot of times.
I mean, you take this Dibond material, which is like 2 very thin layers of aluminium with plastic in the middle, and you cut a score in it so you can fold it. But it's like anything, if you open and close it too many times,
it just snaps.
They snap. So there's this kind of like real chance element. Will it survive the transport? Do you know what I mean? And an element of that is, I think there's something nice about these installations in that sometimes when I get a bit anxious about it, I go to like enormous lengths to try and plan it, and it never pans out because you just have to do it in the moment. Yeah. And then there's other things that happen, like we turn up and, you know, by this time of doing this Coppell project, it's like our 5th or 6th show. 7th doing this set of parts in different, and we're very relaxed about, we'll just improvise it. There's not a lot of planning before we arrive.
You won't have the time, to be honest.
Yeah, and then
Justin has this phrase that is not your original phrase, but necessity is the mother of invention. And I was like, there you go. We're just going to have to work with this and see what we can do.
Yeah, so this time we're really relaxed, and you turn up and you snap the giant sculpture in half. Well, more relaxed in that there wasn't pre-planning.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes I've gone to the extent of building a model of a space, and I have like versions of our sculptures, and Rosa's still works at 10%, and you can put it in a stage set and play with it, and it never really pans out, because you muck about with it, and then when you get in the space, you're like, well, it's so different because now I can see out the window, and that's changed everything.
Yeah. And I guess the part of like what we're sort of, and there was something about like how do we plan these collaborations, but ultimately we sort of see it we were talking about earlier, but like being kind of part of a band, like a 2-person band, but like we can rehearse a little bit in the studio, but ultimately we go to a space, we bring all our material and we work it out.
It's kind of a jam session in the 2 days that you have to install or something.
Yeah.
It's like basically we're the kind of, we don't, it's not like a studio practice where there's long days and weeks of collaborating, because you can't quite.
We've got a gig. We've got to make some stuff.
So
okay.
it's kind of almost on the basis of a gig. Like you turn up with the stuff and do your thing over 2 days. If you're lucky, 5 days.
And then the audience comes in and they become part of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not like the Biggs Collings thing where you're in the studio for months making a painting.
No, it's very different.
And I really want to be colouring in Justin's work in the past.
Or the other way around.
Okay, I don't want to cause any arguments. So much more I did want to ask you about. I'm hoping the audience will have lots of questions, and I just want to ask this recent work just before we open out to them. This is called House Rules, and you made it just before lockdown, but when you were kind of vaguely aware that lockdown might be coming. And it's actually, it looks modular, but it's not. It's the first work you've made that's like solid and won't come to pieces.
Yeah.
The parts now, in a way, this was an opportunity.
I don't have another question.
Well, it was an opportunity because of the show and the context of the show to make one sculpture, and we kind of thought it'd be interesting to sort of go against the rule and fuse the things together. So we have this kind of wooden structure with the mirrors sort of built in.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is, in a way, is it's an object on which you can curate other objects. So for this show, we had a sculpture of Rosalind's father and some plants, but it's this idea that you've made an object which the eventual collector of the object or the person that owns it can curate their own collection of objects onto. So it's an artwork that can house other artworks, but it was also interesting for us to, you kind of have this rule that Ros is always the structures and I'm always the mirrors, and then it's like, well, what? And they're movable. That was been a whole thing, is modular. And then there's always this moment where you just flip it and go, well, let's set it. What happens if you set it and you make one sculpture, and then you look at the different elements that you can put on that sculpture? So, they're just the kind of questions that come up as you make things, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and Karen David curated this show at JGM Gallery, and she gave us a very specific area. And I've shown with Karen before in other curatorial projects, and she's often working with quite a lot of artists. And back when I did show she did a show called Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do.
Well done.
Yeah, I know. And she asked me, and she said she had parameters, and actually somebody sent me parameters. I did a very small sort of modular sculpture, and you had a painting. And it was like when people set you parameters and you're working against that, well, working within it rather than not against it. And then we were like, well, what do we do? We can't just, there was this technical problems. We couldn't just stack a load of my steel, or Justin's sculpture was too large. So I suppose that also that's really interesting when you're offered those opportunities and you're like, okay, well, how do we make this work? But also the fact that it was called House Rules because it was on the brink of lockdown, and we were thinking about all these house rules that we have, all the living rules that we have.
For me, it's also like the kind of finding the rules to make a work.
Yeah.
This piece looks like furniture or a shelving system, but actually all of the decisions about it are very idiosyncratic. So they're made in the making of it. So in a way, it looks like furniture, but it's built like a sculpture. So it's made up as it as it goes along, you know, like you add another bit and then you go, okay, now the mirror goes over there. And so in a funny way, it looks like quite rational furniture, and its design and construction is really irrational. Not irrational, but like not, the decisions aren't quite consistent across it. And that distinguishes it from a design practice. And I'm really interested in the differences between, or these fault lines between art and design, but also like contemporary modes of display, like shop display and art,
which are really interesting actually.
And they are interesting because if you go around some of the really posh Bond Street shops,
it's like Victoria Beckham's shop. They have the most incredible kind of window displays, not with actually even any clothes in it, just like the way they're using mirrors and Louis Vuitton and stuff. And we're like,
but it's
they're
kind
working
of,
with these very incredible architects.
It's an interesting area because shop display has kind of really taken the language of like modern art and the gallery, and had money to do it better. So it's kind of like this weird place where it's kind of like the most amazing shelving to sell a handbag.
Yeah.
But and so this is sort of playing a game, a flirtation with that in a way, to some extent. But this would be an object which, were somebody to buy it, they could then house their own collection of handbags or sculptures or plants on it. So it's this kind of, again, a collaboration with the audience or the collector, and the show was called The Collector.
The
Collector's Room, sorry. And so it was about an object made for a collector's room.
Well, sort of imaginary collector. Go on.
No, I'm just agreeing with you.
I mean, also sort of interestingly, that when we kind of worked on the design, like part of my involvement of that is like actually nurturing the plants in that environment. But my father, who was a sculptor, well, an artist, we put his artwork into this installation, which you can see on the right hand side of the installation, and he died a few weeks ago, and we've just been recreating it in a new conversation about how we might house his sculptural work within our own installation, and it also being collaborative without him physically being part of it. But we've created something, like we've been spending a few days in the studio, I suppose, you know, finding a way to honour him. So it's a collaboration again.
It's now become like a kind of object to house the kind of 4 sculptures of his that we have. But in a way, that's what we imagined for the notional collector.
That they would put their own thing on, and you could commission your own version of it, that you would house your own artwork in. But I guess that's a sort of, it's not a conclusion, but it's a sort of way of also honouring other artists within that slightly furniture art piece, and bringing in the domestic and so on.
And making it very personal as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we should see if we've got any questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop the screen share and look at the chat. So just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, if you can type them into the chat box. I'm just going to see if there's anything in there now.
I see that a couple of you had to.
As a researcher, I'm quite interested in qualitative research methods used when making art. You both talk about the whatever estate it was, beginning with a K.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you're interested in the social political spaces. Do you interact with the people living in these places now, and how do you think those interactions would impact your work? So, for example, interviews with the people that live there, workshops with how they perceive the work. Is that something you've done?
Well, I come from South London, and when I did the projects, I did a series of workshops with people in an adjoining estate in South London. With the Kidbrooke estate, it was much more difficult because basically they had 109 hectares, and hectares is basically your football field. I mean, there's 109 hectares and only 26 people remaining in that space of an abandoned social housing program. It's very complicated, it's very political, and it's quite in depth actually. to talk about it. So I read a lot around that. And it wasn't feasible, and it didn't feel appropriate for me to walk up and knock on the door of some of these people that had bought their property through through Thatcherism, and like, oh well, you can get a new house, and were essentially being asked to lose all the money that they've ever invested in their property and move out. And that was the point of painting about it. That these people are very stuck, and also not, I think there's a balance, and I think photojournalists have that too, of like imposing but being informed.
Mm-hmm.
Very informed, but I wasn't going to go and knock on somebody's house and
When I did that
stuff.
When I turned up to Rosalind's first talk, and there was a painting of a housing estate on this kind of floral fabric, and she got asked a similar question, which was like, well, why are you painting this stuff? And her answer was, well, I live there.
And I think there's a presumption.
Was brought up there.
Yeah, and I think there's a presumption about maybe how I look or sound, is that I may seem like I'm a middle-class white person, and I actually didn't grow up in that way at all. I
did a project, which is maybe, I think what the question is getting at, but on the Tricorn Centre in Portsmouth, which was this huge brutalist building that was probably one of the country's greatest brutalist examples of architecture.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's
very sculptural, but, you know, really brutal kind of structure. And I became involved in that building at the point at which the local council were trying to get it demolished. So the building had become like a political football.
Mm.
And the 20th Century Society, who are people that I'm kind of really interested in, but they like protect buildings like this, they were trying to get it listed. And what happened is I made a solo show about that place, but at the time between it being sort of hoarded off and getting ready for demolition, and what happened is the council got it demolished a day before the 20th century, or the sign off to get it demolished a day before the 20th century society got it listed. So this is really interesting how, and the council did it on the basis that they were going to build something shiny and new there. And actually what the 20th Century Society was saying is this building is amazing if we just clean it and revisit its original vision. It would be amazing. That site in Portsmouth is still sat empty. There was never a new shopping centre, flats, car parks built. So I think we both were involved in different ways in those discussions and debates. And so, you know, it's interesting because there is this kind of thing about, you know, is it just an aesthetic?
Yeah, but also importantly, I mean, around Kibrick, no, I didn't go and interview people, but I did work with people in the community. I did workshops, and I also went and did interviews with them. And also when I had a solo show at Stephen Lawrence Gallery.
Uh-huh.
It was originally in Stephen Lawrence Centre. Now it's moved elsewhere. But I went and I did an exhibition that included the Stephen Lawrence building, and talked to people that had been invested in that. And like, I often go and do research. It doesn't always translate to, in a way, like, oh, you know, just because we didn't have the technology, like, I don't know, 10 years ago, like having podcasts. But I would go and talk to people about also the way that the building had impacted them. And when I had a solo show at Bruce Castle Museum, and I did workshops with people that had been affected by the riots. I did a lot of workshops with women who basically I recorded the conversations, but not in a public way, but just as a way of listening and learning. And I was teaching them stitching and all sorts of things. So it's not, there's never a thing in that kind of way when you're dealing with social housing that doesn't, for me, all just involve the people around it. It's hard to necessarily translate. I mean, it could be school kids coming or whatever, but that's very much an intention within that work that is so socially, historically, politically, you know, rich. Rich is not the right word.
Yeah, but in terms of subject matter,
it's not like we just come in as like some sort of cleanliness or something, and like, oh well, this looks interesting. It's like part of my heritage is to have been part of social housing. I've been in social housing. I'm, you know, my family still are, and the complications for that. But also, I always look at historical news, everything. I mean, honestly, if you want to quiz me about social housing, I can.
I think we might have to save that for another day.
Anyway, sorry.
yeah.
I think that's actually all of the questions. There's a lot of comments coming in and thank yous and stories that they can't stay for the Q&A, but
I've no idea at the time because we just turned up on time.
Yeah, it's nearly 5 to 8 actually, so I think I will probably at this point just screen share again so that they've got your websites in case people want to take another look at your work, and this would be the point, as I always say, in the gallery in the school where you would be getting a huge round of applause. So thank you, and here's my virtual round of applause, and I'm sure everyone else is sending you one from home. So yeah, thank you both, and thank you to everyone who's watching and will watch in the future, and of course a huge thank you to Heatherleys for hosting and having been so on the ball with starting up this online series.
Thank you, Heatherleys, and thank you for everyone that's come and listened and who will listen in the future. We'll be sharing on our social media and websites, because this one will be one that will stay up on the Heatherleys website, so you can come and listen and hear about collaborative works and our ideas and stuff, which I hope you're finding inspiring.
Well, I found it really inspiring, and it's been a pleasure listening to you today and in the series of talks. And like I said at the beginning, this is actually the final one in the series. So goodness knows what the situation will be come the next term in terms of COVID, etc. But the Heatherleys school page and Facebook page are also on the screen now, so just keep an eye on those for information about forthcoming events. And once again, just a huge thank you to everyone.
Thanks,
Summer, stay safe.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And then I'm just gonna kick everyone out.
Hit us out, go on.